welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and I am so thrilled to have the author of this great book that I spent all day yesterday reading. It's called Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. As is Dr. Justin Lehmiller, which when I looked you up, I have a little bit of information, but I'd like for you to introduce yourself. But you have a Ph.D. in social psychology from Purdue University. You're a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. You've taught at such places as Harvard University, and you've published many academic articles and run a very popular blog called Sex and Psychology. So what else do you want to tell us about yourself? Tell me a little bit about how do you go from like a PhD in social psychology to writing about sex?
Right. Well, hi, Natasha. Thanks for having me. Always happy to talk about sex research. So it's funny, when I went to graduate school, I went to study the psychology of romantic relationships. And I didn't actually realize that being a sex researcher was an option until I became a teaching assistant for a human sexuality course. And I started to realize how relationship researchers weren't really studying sex, which is kind of a problem, kind of an oversight, because sex is a big part of a lot of people's relationships. So that's sort of what inspired me to start going into sex research. And it wasn't really until I left graduate school that I started really immersing myself in it and conducting research in this area. And I've been doing it for about the last 10 years now. I've written a textbook on human sexuality. I've run the blog for the last 7 years now. And then I've also been just researching and writing about sex and speaking about it publicly in larger and larger quantities ever since then.
That's awesome. That mirrors a little bit of my experience as a marriage and family therapist. You know, when I started becoming a sex therapist, I was like, why are some of these things not coming up with the same conclusions when I'm studying, you know, and I originally studied marriage, which I would hope includes sex at some level. So yeah, that was an interesting thing. And you made me want to become a researcher after reading this book. So now I'm sad that I'm not a researcher, but anyway.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah, it was so fun, except for I hated my statistics class. But other than that, I would love to be a researcher. All right. So this book is basically based on a 2-year study that you conducted. So I'd like to start with just you telling me a little bit about how that study came about and what it entailed. So, for example, I know offhand that you had 4,000 participants, which is a huge number for most psychological studies. Many studies, I don't know that people realize, but maybe would only have like 25 participants or maybe 100 participants, which that in of itself seems a lot of times like a large study. So 4,000 is like astronomical. So tell me a little bit about how you came to just the parameters of the study.
Right. So as I mentioned, I wrote a textbook on human sexuality. And in doing that, I had to review all of the published literature on sex fantasies. And what I found was that a lot of it was based on these small studies that were primarily based on college students. And college students aren't the only ones who have sexual fantasies.
Yeah.
Obviously. So I had
white
a lot of
college adult males, right? That's what most of our psychological understanding is based on.
Right. So I wanted to study fantasies in a more diverse context, but also address a lot of questions that had just never really been answered. For example, how we see ourselves in our sexual fantasies, how our fantasies are connected to our personality traits, and what our fantasies really say about us and our culture. So I designed this study. In the end, it was almost 4,200 participants from all states, all 50 states in the US, who completed this massive survey of about 369 questions that asked them about their biggest fantasy of all time, hundreds of people, places, things they might have ever fantasized about, as well as their personality traits, demographics, and sexual histories. So it's a massive data set.
Yeah. And then can you tell me a little bit about what they looked like? So I think in the book you mentioned like 72% identified as heterosexual, for example, or how many men versus women.
Right. So the sample was about a 50-50 split between those who were male and female identified. The sample was predominantly heterosexual. but significant numbers of people who are bisexual, gay, or lesbian participated as well. It represented people of different political and religious backgrounds. Certainly there was somewhat of a selection bias for people who were more politically liberal to begin with, and people who had more positive attitudes towards sex. But that's something that's characteristic of all sex research. People who are just more comfortable talking about sex are more inclined to participate. But the good news is that it's still a very diverse sample, people ranging in age up to 88, I believe was the oldest person.
Oh, wow.
And so you've got a lot of diversity there in a lot of ways.
Okay. And it was fairly also a monogamous sample. Is that correct? As far as people who were in monogamous relationships?
Right. Most people who were in relationships reported being in a sexually exclusive relationship. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So right off the bat, since we mentioned LGBT population, I would love to jump into something that you talk about, which is sexual orientation versus sexual flexibility. So oftentimes, I think in our culture, we consider ourselves heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, end of story, right? Like when it comes to sexual orientation, it's like you got to choose one of those buckets. And yet a lot of what you found in your work was what you came to deem sexual flexibility, or these ideas that regardless of what people might orient themselves towards, they may still have fantasies. So can you talk a little bit about how you define those two terms so that when we talk about those issues, people will know what we're talking about?
Sure. So everybody has a sexual orientation, which refers largely to the gender of the persons that you're attracted to, or gender or sex, whichever term it is that you want to use there. So that could be heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, asexual being a lack of attraction. So everyone has this orientation. But in addition to that, we all have some degree of what I call sexual flexibility, which is our willingness to deviate from what our orientation might be, and also deviate more generally from what social and cultural norms and expectations for sexuality might be. So for somebody who is very low on sexual flexibility, their sexual orientation is their orientation, and they're not going to deviate from it. But for somebody who is high on sexual flexibility, if their orientation is heterosexual, they might still have same-sex experiences at some point because they're just more flexible by nature. Terms that are related to sexual flexibility also include sexual fluidity. That's something that people might be more familiar with, where their attractions, behaviors might change or fluctuate over the course of the lifespan. What we see in the research is that both men and women can be flexible when it comes to their sexuality. Women seem to have a little bit more of this flexibility than men, but it's there. And so that's why we see a lot of variability over the lifespan in people's attractions, behaviors, and sometimes even in the identity labels that they choose.
The reason why I think this is so important, and why I thought, just coming from the Mormon lens, as somebody who's worked a lot with religiously conservative communities, is that anytime you talk about sexual fluidity or flexibility, it can unfortunately buoy up these arguments that these are things that you can quote unquote change, and so for a lot of people who their moral values maybe are different than their sexual orientation would, deem as far as a lifestyle that they can make for themselves. A lot of people, like with conversion therapies and things like that, might use some of these concepts, which is very concerning to me because we know the research, regarding conversion therapy and how harmful it is and how it doesn't work. And so I really want to just normalize for people that they can orient themselves very much in an identity of sexual orientation. And yet we may have, especially fantasies, which are fluid. Do you want to talk anything about that as far as any concerns you might share with me on that regard?
I think you're absolutely right in the concerns that you have, because we have seen people who take research on sexual fluidity and flexibility and use it to imply that sexual orientation is a choice and that we can choose our attractions. But that's not what the research here says. This is not a conscious, deliberate choice that people are making. We also don't fully understand the factors that might lead to shifts in people's attractions, behaviors, fantasies over the course of their lives. So there's a lot here that we still don't know, but it does not seem to be the case that it's a conscious choice that people are making.
Okay, thank you. Another thing that I just wanted to right off the bat kind of distinguish between is fantasy and reality. And you are studying fantasy. And you mentioned that several times in the book, that sometimes there were studies of people, for example, people who are into kink or BDSM, and they might do studies with people who are comfortable visiting dungeons or those kinds of settings. But those are people who are acting out their fantasies, which is very different than the majority of people, because I think you said only about a third, if I remember correctly, of people will actually act out their fantasies. So most of what you're studying are what people are thinking about, what people are titillated by, what people might be wanting to consider thinking or role playing or doing something fun within the context of maybe their own comfortable relationship or their own home environment without actually going and doing some of these things. So you want to talk a little bit about just anything in that realm as far as just pointing out that, yeah, this is fantasy we're talking about, not necessarily what actually people are doing.
Sure. I think there are a couple of important distinctions there. One is a sexual fantasy versus a sexual desire versus a sexual behavior. These are all different things. So a sexual fantasy is some mental thought or image you have that turns you on. And your sexual fantasy could be a desire, meaning that it's something that you want to act on, but you can also have fantasies that are not desires. They're thoughts that might turn you on, but you have no desire to ever act them out in the real world. So I think it's important to make that distinction between a fantasy and a desire. Some people do take that step and go from making their fantasy into reality. As you mentioned, it's about a third of my participants who said they had done so, but about 80% of them said that they did want to act on their biggest fantasy of all time. So at least for people's biggest fantasy, it does seem to be a desire. And there's a pretty big gap between, what people say turns them on and what it is that they're actually doing. And I think that if we worked a little bit more in communicating about our desires and maybe acting more on some of those that are safe and sane and consensual, that people might help to achieve greater levels of sexual and relationship satisfaction.
Okay, thank you. So that gets us right to the point of people are super hesitant to talk about their desires. They're hesitant sometimes in their own self, right? Like, is this something that's normal? Why does this turn me on? Why am I thinking this? So sometimes there's a lot of angst and anxiety just personally. And then there's definitely that next step of anxiety, which is, why would I ever want to share something so scary or taboo or whatever with my actual partner? So do you want to talk a little bit about, I'm not sure this is something you studied necessarily, but I think you definitely start off with the idea that people are worried, or maybe it was part of your questionnaire, that people are worried about what they think about.
Right. I did ask people what their emotions were regarding their biggest fantasy of all time. And I found that there was a lot of shame and guilt and embarrassment that was tied up in a lot of the fantasies that people reported having. And a lot of people said that those emotions prevented or inhibited them from talking about their fantasies with a partner, and also from ever acting on them. That negative emotional piece is something that we need to address, and in terms of looking at where does that come from and how can we break down some of those barriers to communicating about sex. Because when you're talking about something that is so shameful for a lot of people, it's just practically impossible for them to ever begin a conversation about it. So we need to step back and start to remove some of the shame from our sexual desires and fantasies so that we can begin having open conversations about them.
Well, and again, working with a religiously conservative community, what I have found is that unfortunately in a lot of the both Mormon and Christian kind of dogmas, there's this idea that your thoughts can condemn you, not just your actions, right? And so if you just by thinking about things that maybe don't follow a certain religious script or a certain moral script, for example, wanting to have sex with more than one person, or it's something outside of a marital context or anything along those lines, makes people feel these kinds of feelings of intense shame and embarrassment, and then not realizing that it's actually a very common thought to have. Like, one of the things that I'm excited to get into is the statistics of how many people have these types of thoughts. So, which is something I never had before. I was like, I think it's common, because a lot of people come in with this. Now I can say 80% of people. Yeah, because that mirrors, what I see in my office. So that's exciting. But yeah, and I think you do touch on that in the book as well, that people from religious affiliations tended to be affected as far as they looked slightly different than the rest of the population as far as how they showed up with what types of fantasies they would enjoy having.
Right. And something that's related to that is I asked participants to guess for their biggest fantasy of all time, what percentage of the population also shares that fantasy. And what I found was that people tended to really underestimate how common their fantasies were. And the rarer that people thought their fantasies were, the more shame and guilt and embarrassment they felt about them. So I think
Super
understanding and just how common our fantasies are can normalize them to some extent, and that can help us to feel less conflicted about them so that we can talk about and share them. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to act on them, but I think it's important that we have control over and acknowledge our sexual thoughts and fantasies. When we instead start repressing them and running away from them, that's where we run into problems. And we see that when people try to suppress thoughts, that it often leads to this obsessive preoccupation with them that is psychologically distressing and unhealthy. So we need to accept our sexual thoughts rather than just try and bury them as deeply as we can.
I love that. Yeah, that's so much of the work I try to do is helping people, match, like, we're going to honor your values, but we're also going to honor your pleasure, right? And the things that you're thinking about, and how do we, as best as possible, kind of marry those things so that you can have good quality of life. So that's great. Okay, so let's dive into, I think, what are you kind of came up with 7 broad themes so you kind of took all this data and you had this nice little graphic image of all these words that people kind of came up with to, you asked them to come up with one word to basically describe their biggest fantasy. And then you came up with this really lovely graphic. I liked it. I really enjoyed that. But then you took all of that and you kind of organized it into 7 broad themes. So I thought we would just start out by going through those. And out of those 7, it seemed like the first 3 were extremely common. And then the next 4 were kind of like subcommon. So the first 3 were kind of like very, very prolific and showing up in people's fantasies. And I want to, I'm inviting you back to talk more in depth with some of these things. So I'm not sure I want to talk a lot about gender differences right now. But I think one thing that was very interesting is, especially with these first 3, there wasn't a huge difference between males and females. There was some, and I'd like to get into that, but just to kind of start off the general conversation, it's not like men typically are the only ones who think about this and women are typically the only ones who think about this. There was a lot of interweaving between female and male people. And at the same time, we might get into some of the intricacies of how that differs later. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I think, when it comes to some of these fantasy themes, you see that the vast majority of men and women are having them, but there may be differences in how frequently they have them. And, that's something we could come back to a little bit later.
Okay. All right, great. So the number 1 is multi-partner. This is, let's bring somebody else into the equation, whether it's one person's like a threesome, or maybe 2 people, or a full-blown orgy, or anything along those lines. Is that a fair way to characterize that?
Yep. Multi-partner was seemingly the most popular theme. It was, more than 90% of men, and I think it was close to 90% of women who had multi-partner fantasies before. Threesomes were the most popular form that they took, and that's why when I created a word cloud of, people's favorite fantasies and those one-word descriptions, threesome was the word that shows up most prominently. So that can take a lot of different forms, but it seems very normative for people to be turned on by this idea of having more than one partner at the same time.
And what correlates did you make that as far as what that means? Because I think that's a lot of what your chapters go into. So does this mean that people are dissatisfied with their primary relationship, that they find their partner boring or unattractive, or that, they just really would rather be having sex with somebody else? I mean, these are kind of some of the meaning ruts that I think people get into with these kinds of idea, like, why are you thinking about another person? And yet I don't think you found any of those things to be the case. So what did you find it to be about?
So when it came to threesomes, for people who were in romantic relationships, the vast majority of the time they wanted their partner to be one of those other people. So it wasn't the case that people are thinking about, just being with total random strangers when they're in relationships. They want their partner to be a part of this scenario. And that relates to something else I found a little later in the book, where I talk about how the one person who's most likely to appear in your sex fantasies is your current romantic partner, which I think a lot of us can take is a, sort of reassuring and comforting sign, that we're not trying to replace our partners. We're just trying to add a dose or element of novelty and newness and excitement to our sex lives. And I think that's ultimately what these group sex fantasies are about. It's just amping up the arousal level by bringing in someone new. And so that's fundamentally what it seems to be about. It's just this craving for novelty and excitement.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So number 2 theme was some type of power control. And I think you kind of summed this up by the acronym BDSM. So do you want to talk a little bit about what that term means, how you defined it in your book, and what were some of the themes that were coming up in that regard?
Sure. BDSM is kind of a mouthful. It stands for bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, masochism. And what all of those terms come down to is that you're playing with power in some way or control. And this can take a lot of different forms, from tying a partner up to engaging in sadomasochistic activities such as spankings or something else more intense in some cases, to just having one partner take a more dominant and the other taking a more submissive role. This is one of the broadest and most diverse fantasy themes because it can take so many forms. But what I see is that, again, the vast majority of men and women, we're talking 90 or so percent again, who are reporting having some of these BDSM fantasies at one time or another.
Yeah, and these can range in huge spectrums, right? I mean, it's fairly common to have a slight spanking, even in a lot of maybe what would be considered vanilla relationships, or even holding an arm, towards the bedpost or something. And then you can take it a little further with blindfolds and, some type of handcuffs, or kind of a popular sex toy. And then there are kind of more extreme measures with whips and kind of different costumes, even different places where people go to experience these types of things. So the spectrum runs wide, right, in this forum. And I think what a lot of people struggle with, at least in my office, is that what's wrong with me? And that I either like to inflict pain, because again, that doesn't fall into my value system. A lot of people really struggle with separating out my morals and my values. I don't want to hurt anybody. I feel like I'm a nice person, but then it's kind of fun to inflict pain, or it's fun to receive pain in some way, or some form of submission when I'm like, a badass feminist, or, I'm like super important in my job, but then I like to be, play this very submissive role. So what's wrong with me? Why do these things come up? So do you have any insights into why people might think that this is so, I guess, in conflict with their values, or how they see themselves outside of the bedroom?
Yeah, I think you described it pretty well in that, the conflict for a lot of people with BDSM is that it just doesn't fit with the way they see themselves. It's in many ways this very transgressive act, where we have this idea of what sex should be, and it should be gentle and loving and romantic. And I think when people see sex in that way, and then what they're turned on by is something involving pain or power or control, that's just so radically different from what they've been told, maybe from their religion or from their culture and society, that it starts to make them feel weird or unusual about it. But again, what we see is this is an incredibly common, and I would say normative, sexual desire in terms of how many people report having it. And again, it's something that ranges from, very mild to wild. I think, a lot of people think that if you're talking about BDSM and you're into it, that you're this really big social deviant and that you're going to have this dungeon and, engage in these really intense activities. But for the vast majority of people, it's very mild and often just symbolic forms of pain that might be integrated into their sexuality. So, it's not something where the other person is really being hurt in some way, and everything occurs within these very consensual, clear, and explicit limits. So, I think the way we tend to think about BDSM is different from the reality of how most people practice it.
Well, and you talk a little bit in the book too about how the sexual arousal response does numb pain, and also you mentioned disgust. So those were two things, that, and I often tease about this on my, if somebody came up right now and like grabbed my nipples, I'd probably be knocking you out, right? And I'd be
right.
Like, oh, that is so painful. And yet that same amount of pressure, or that same amount of friction, or even more pressure, is very pleasurable once I'm aroused, right? So our bodies do respond differently in an arousal state than a non-arousal state. And that, plays into some of this, why certain amounts of pain or pressure can be very pleasurable.
Absolutely. And what you mentioned there about, your sexual arousal changing your disgust response is part of the reason why when it comes to sharing and talking about your fantasies with your partner, that you probably want to do that when you're both in a state of sexual arousal already, right? Where that disgust response is going to be lessened and it's going to reduce some of those barriers to communicating openly about your desires. Because if you just go into it in this cold and unaroused state, it's more likely that, one partner might be judgmental of the other or have a disgust response rather than thinking, oh, that might be fun to try. So yeah, I think that's a really important point to make there.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder for me, because I often talk to people about having, kind of at the table discussions about sexuality like it's normal, but I do forget that disgust factor might be there. I guess the only concern about that is if you bring up something that the arousal doesn't necessarily help with, while you're in the bedroom, and then it kind of, stops, I guess, a sexual encounter that you're enjoying, that can be a little problematic, and why I maybe sometimes encourage the dinner room discussion. But at the same time, I think that there's room for both, right? Like, I think that that's a really good thing to remember, that sometimes when we're turned on, it can be fun to introduce something new and see how you take a little bit of that risk and see if it's something that could possibly turn you on as well.
Right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just during sex when you would bring this up. It could be you've just, watched a movie or a TV show where there was this sex scene, and then you can sort of talk about it afterwards. So there are lots of ways where you can interject this, bring it up where there might already be a little bit of sexual arousal that can help make that conversation a little easier.
Yeah, great. I love that. One of the things that I think was very, very important that you talked about, and I was so glad to see it, because I've had especially so many women or sexual assault victims come in with themes about forced sexuality, rape fantasies, as they oftentimes present them, at very, very distressed about them usually. Like, what's wrong with me? Why would I want, especially if something happened to me in the past, why would I want to relive that? What's wrong with me? I'm broken somehow. Or if I have never lived through sexual trauma, why would I want to, experience something that I hear is so traumatic? Again, what's wrong with me? Oftentimes too, the partners, especially in heterosexual marriages where I've worked with husbands who are like, there's no way, in hell that I'm going to participate in a rape fantasy with my wife when that's, I don't want to hurt her or things like that. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about what you found out? It was shocking to me to see how common it was. It's been very common in my office, but to have you validate that was very, very helpful for me as a clinician.
Yeah, I've read up on the research on, I guess I call them forced sex fantasies rather than rape fantasies, because, I don't see these fantasies as bearing any resemblance to a real world rape or sexual assault, because it's all taking place in your head where you're in control. You decide who your partner is and the terms and circumstances and conditions under which this happens. So I think in terms of removing some of the shame and guilt and anxiety about these fantasies, it's starting with recognizing that this is not about rape or sexual assault, right? This is a consensual fantasy ultimately that takes place on your terms. And what I see is that about 2/3 of the women I surveyed reported having these fantasies about sex being forced on them. And just over half of men reported having these fantasies as well. Women are more likely to have these fantasies and have them more often, but they do seem to transcend gender and also sexual orientation and other demographic traits and characteristics. So I think ultimately these fantasies are just a different variation on the BDSM fantasies, because there's some element of dominance and submission that's involved here, sometimes a sadomasochistic element involved as well, maybe even bondage. So it's really just a different variation on BDSM is the way I view it.
I love that. Yeah. And I have found it very helpful with sexual assault victims when they are able to reframe this as, this is something I get to be in charge of. This is something I get to decide what it's going to look like, how far it's going to go. And especially when you have a partner who's willing to play with you in that way, it can be incredibly healing, I think, for many people to feel that sense of empowerment and control in a situation where that, in a very slight way, like you're saying, mimics a situation where they did not have control. So, and I like how you distinguish, because consent is a huge part of this, whereas criminal activity has no consent involved.
No. And, I should say I did find a very, very small correlation between having experienced sexual victimization and having these forced sex fantasies. So there is something there in the data that validates your clinical experience. But this is something that is uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about how, if you have been victimized, some people do then fantasize about these forced sex scenarios. Like I said, it's an uncomfortable conclusion, but it's a reality that we see in the data, that you see in your clinical practice. And I think we need to think differently about this, acknowledge it, and recognize that maybe these sexual fantasies are therapeutic for these individuals in some way, and they're helping them to come to terms with this trauma that they've experienced. And so maybe it's not something to be so shameful about, but rather it's something we need to acknowledge and recognize could be therapeutic for them.
I agree. I think a lot of people see their healing process as not having these fantasies anymore, whereas I try to encourage them to look at it more as a diversification, so that you can still have these fantasies. There's nothing wrong with these fantasies. Like you're saying, people who haven't even been sexually traumatized have these fantasies a lot. And yet we also want you to hopefully have a diversity of things that can turn you on and that you can feel good about if you feel like that one thing is too prevalent, maybe.
Yep.
All right, great. So the number 3 one that was very, very common was novelty. So novelty, newness. What kind of things fall under that umbrella for you?
This was another really broad category, but it was fundamentally about just doing something new and different in your sex life. That could be trying a new position. It could be having sex in a place that you've never done before. So I find it's very common for people to have fantasies that take place outside of their own bed. So this could be another room in the house. It could be in a hotel. It could be on a beach. So it's just sort of adding a different element or dimension to sex. And I found that certain people were more likely to have these fantasies about different settings than others. And in particular, people who were really high in this personality trait called conscientiousness, which basically means they're very detail-oriented by nature. So people who are detail-oriented in the real world tend to be very detail-oriented in their fantasies, and they fantasize about a much wider range of settings. But fundamentally, these fantasies are just amping up the arousal by trying something new or different for you. And that could be very different from one person to the next.
And I think that you covered a little bit about how our brains work. I mean, in a sense, many things do over time kind of become habitual. So if you've done something, even if you're enjoying it, for several years, especially for those who are maybe in relationships, over decades together, it can get a little bit rote and routine and boring. And why I think novelty is such an important thing. And maybe even from a developmental lens, that was another thing you talked about, was kind of at different points of time in life, you might have some of these things be more important than other things. And I'm guessing novelty might be one that if you're in like a 30-year relationship, it might become more important than if you're in a 2-year relationship.
Right. So we see a lot in the research about when people are exposed to the same sexual stimulus over time, they show less arousal to it. So for example, if men and women watch the same porn clip every day over a period of a week, they'll show less arousal to it over time. But if you show them a new clip, then their arousal kicks back up again. We see this in long-term relationships too, where you've got this time period, there's a lot of passion and excitement. And that's usually, 6 months to 2 years is sort of in the sweet spot for experiencing passion. Some people maintain it for their entire lives in a long-term relationship, but for most people, it seems to die out pretty quickly. And it's something that is largely this product of the fact that we need continued novelty and excitement to keep our arousal and our passion up and going. And I think that's where these novelty fantasies are coming from. It's just interjecting that dose of newness or novelty. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something extreme or crazy, right? It could just be anything new, like doing it in a new room in the house, or trying a new position, or experimenting with sex toys. There are so many ways you can add novelty where you don't necessarily have to, try group sex or swingers clubs, or, it's do something within your own comfort zone.
I think this is really important for, a certain population I'm thinking about right now is low desire women. A lot of times in my clinic, low desire women show up with this idea that there's something wrong with them. And yet when I talk to them about their sexuality, their sexual fantasies, their sexual behaviors, it does feel very rote and kind of routine. You know, they haven't really explored much. And so they're thinking there's something wrong with them when maybe really they're just kind of normal and they just need more stimulation because that's how their brain and their genitals are going to respond to versus, thinking they're broken somehow.
Yeah, I think oftentimes when people have low desire, it's not necessarily because there's something, say, biologically going on with them that's changing their desire level. Oftentimes they've just lost desire for the sex they're having because it got boring and routine. By increasing communication and by adding newness and novelty to our relationships, we might be able to address those issues with desire without having to take drugs or pills or anything like that to try and boost our libidos.
Okay, good. All right, number 4. So now we're going into the category. I mean, these 1, 2, 3 were super. Do you want to go over really quickly just the stats? I mean, I think you did for number 1 that was like 90 in the 90th percentile. Did you mention the stats for power control and for novelty as far as how much that showed up?
Yeah, the BDSM fantasies were in the 80 to 90% range. The novelty fantasies, it really varied on what aspect of novelty you were talking about, but it was so pervasive that, it's more than 3/4 of participants who are fantasizing about that as well. So These 3 themes, I think, are pervasive in the population.
Yeah. Like pretty much if you're having them, so's your neighbor. Maybe so's your spouse, so's your partner, and maybe you don't even know that yet. All right. So now we're going to go into the next realm, which they were also common, but maybe not quite as common. So number 4 is taboo. And for me, as soon as I hear taboo, I think forbidden fruit, whatever is forbidden or feels a little off or off the charts, it's like we're drawn to, the cookie jar we're not supposed to get into. So can you talk about what taboo meant in this particular realm?
Right. So taboo fantasies were all about just doing something that you're not supposed to do because the political, religious, or other moral authorities tell you that you're not supposed to do it. So this spanned a very wide range, but within that taboo category, I included things like voyeurism, so spying on other people who are having sex or undressing. It includes exhibitionistic acts where people are exposing themselves. It includes fetishistic acts as well, so having fetishes for clothing or body parts or whatever. These are all fantasies that tend to be looked down upon, stigmatized socially, or they're things that we are explicitly told we shouldn't do.
And again, some of these might, when you go from fantasy to reality, might have a criminal component to them. And probably that's why some of that stigma exists, right? So if you're showing yourself to people without their consent or spying on people without their consent, that's obviously problematic. And yet these are very times fantasies that people have a lot of fun with that are not criminal at all.
Right.
Just in the comfort of their own home or with consent, or there's lots of fun ways to deal with these. One thing that I'd like to maybe talk a little bit that you jumped into right at the beginning of your book is how we as a mental health profession haven't been very helpful in this regard. We have pathologized and kind of, made a lot of these types of sexual interests not only feel deviant from a religious or political background, but from a medical background. Like there is something actually, you're diagnosable now because you have this interest. So do you want to talk a little bit about our role and how we've messed people up?
Sure. So psychologists and psychiatrists have used the term paraphilia to refer to any type of unusual sexual interest. And paraphilias have long been considered to be disordered behaviors. So there's long been an entry in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, that lists out specific paraphilias, and fetishism would be one that's included in there. Sadomasochism is included in there as well as a paraphilia. But what I see in the research is that these are actually very common things that people fantasize about. So why are we calling them unusual when they're so prevalent in the population? That's why I think it's important, and I was glad to see in the most recent edition of the DSM, they started to make this distinction between having a paraphilia, which is an unusual sexual interest, and having a paraphilic disorder, which is an unusual sexual interest that is causing distress to the individual or is non-consensual and poses a risk of harm to themselves or to others. I think starting to decouple, this idea of having an unusual interest from having a disorder is a really important one. But by virtue of still listing things like fetishism and sadomasochism in the DSM, we're still stigmatizing these behaviors to some degree.
And this is where I think the public probably gets a little nervous or uncomfortable, because some of these paraphilias, probably the most controversial one would be pedophilia, for example.
Right.
People who fantasize about having any type of sexual encounter with a pre-adolescent youth, which is different than a teenager who has been, that's still criminal, but it's not pedophilia. But what we understand, because of something that you said earlier, is that when anxiety is apt, when people have to keep things more secretive, when people are more distressed about something, we actually find more preoccupation, more risk than for actual acting out on behaviors. So the more that we're unable to talk about and normalize how we may have some thoughts that are just thoughts and that are there and that we don't have to act out on them, we're actually doing a disservice to the general public by making it so taboo to even be able to talk about it. Imagine if you're somebody who has pedophilic thoughts, who are you going to talk to about that without being very, very afraid that, you're going to have some very real ramifications, even if you've never acted on that thought, so that's
right.
Aware of.
We're also not doing enough within the mental health community to teach therapists, counselors, psychologists how to appropriately counsel and help people who might have these potentially dangerous fantasies and desires like pedophilia. For example, in one of my previous academic jobs, I was working in a counseling psychology department, and the level of sex therapy training in there was pretty minimal to non-existent. And issues like pedophilia only happened to come up in my classes because as a sex researcher, I thought it was important for counselors to know and understand this. But I would have students who were getting ready to go out the door to start serving clients who had never been talked to about how you even have a conversation with a client who might, say, have pedophilic interests. So how can we expect our therapists to be able to help people if we're not even giving them the tools and resources to be able to do that?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So where were you percentage-wise with taboo? What kind of percentages came up?
It was a slight majority of participants who reported having taboo desires. It depended on which specific taboo it was. A majority of participants reported having voyeuristic fantasies where they were spying on other people. Fewer had the sort of exhibitionistic desires. And there was a lot of variability in the fetishes, with some being more common than others. But foot and shoe fetishes tended to be the most common sorts of fetishes that emerged there.
Cross-dressing came up quite a bit too in at least what I was reading is something that's fairly common, and again, something that's very taboo. And I've seen a lot of couples really struggle with a disclosure of cross-dressing. And so that can feel very threatening to maybe the spouse if they find out that their, especially male partner, is cross-dressing. Some of those uncomfortable relationships we have with femininity versus masculinity and sexual scripts.
Right. And it was actually men who were most likely to have these cross-dressing fantasies. I guess I called them gender-bending fantasies in the book, where they're sort of playing with their gender role or expression. And I've had so many women who have written to me over the years who say, my husband is interested in cross-dressing, or, I saw him watching porn that involved transgender actors. And then they come to me and wonder, well, is my husband really gay or what? So, there is a lot of concern there, and I'm sure you see it too in your clinical practice. But people start to wonder about, what does this mean for their sexual identity, for their relationship? Are they still attracted to me? But what we see is it's actually pretty common for people to have these desires.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's not that forbidden for me to dress up like a man. I kind of do that every day. I wear pants, right. And even if I got a tie on or something, that those are not necessarily as eye-catching as, a man wearing a skirt or a blouse or, putting on lipstick. I mean, we have a lot more social kind of taboos. So it makes sense that it would show up more for males because, again, if it's not forbidden, then you're not going to be pushing up against that forbidden kind of energy.
Right.
All right. Number 5 was partner sharing. Now, this is different from multi-partner in what ways? How did you distinguish between the difference?
So with the multi-partner fantasies, that's about having several partners at the same exact time involved in the same sex act. In the non-monogamy fantasies, I'm talking about having a relationship that allows you to have multiple different sexual and or romantic partners simultaneously, not all in bed with you at the same time, but you might have multiple relationships. So this could involve something like, say, swinging, where you might swap partners with another couple, or it could involve having an open relationship where you have your primary partner, but you can still go have casual sex with other people on the side. So it's really just more about changing the structure of the relationship rather than bringing multiple people into the bedroom together.
And this came out fairly high, with 80% of men interested in this fantasy and 60% of women. Mm-hmm. And also, I think you mentioned, sometimes we think of college kids as those who want lots of partners. And actually what you're finding is people more in midlife and older adults more interested in this, which makes sense from the perspective of, we're done raising our kids. We're kind of, again, we've been in a long-term relationship. Maybe we want to, do things differently than we've done for the rest. We don't want to necessarily feel anchored, in some ways for the rest of our lives. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. When people are in these very long-term monogamous relationships, they need some way to interject novelty, and having an open relationship is some way that people find to navigate that. But also, when you're in a long-term relationship with someone, it's very hard to have one person who can meet any and all needs that you have sexually, emotionally, and otherwise. And so having some sort of open relationship, many people find, reduces the pressure on one partner to be everything to you all at once. And for some people, that makes them happier in the end. That's not to say that open relationships are right for everyone or that we should all go out and do this, but rather that maybe different relationship structures work well for different people.
And again, if you have the fantasy of it, doesn't mean that you're doing it. But
Right.
And sometimes just even having the fantasy can be helpful, even if you're not actually doing it, to, again, introduce some of that novelty or that different type of energy.
Right. And sometimes just talking about the fantasy with your partner is enough, that can be arousing for some people, and it never goes any further than that. And that's fine too. It's ultimately about you and your partner and your comfort zone.
Yeah. Great. All right. So the number 6 category was romance. I think a lot of times people are like, fantasy, that's, like this wild, kind of maybe, again, taboo type of stuff. But you included romance and just having romantic fantasies and intimacy fantasies and kind of coupling fantasies, I guess, in some ways. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, these are fantasies that are all about meeting your emotional needs. So it's connecting with the partner emotionally or spiritually. It's about having that sense of passion that maybe you had initially with your partner that you've lost and you want to regain. Or maybe it's about you just feeling desired or wanted or competent or validated. There are all kinds of emotional needs that people try to meet through their fantasies. And I see that a majority of men and women report having these emotion-based fantasies. It was actually pretty rare for people to report having fantasies about totally emotionless sex, right? Where it's just this sort of mechanical sex act. Most of the time, it seems we're trying to meet some need through our fantasies, which I think is important to recognize. And it's not just women who do this, right? Men have a lot of this emotional content too. And so sex is this very emotional experience, I think, for most of us, which is important to recognize.
And the intersection between the emotional components and maybe some of the other categories as well. So that if you're looking at pornography, or if you're, considering multi-partner sex, that those are not devoid of emotional components that then also return to your partner. I think a lot of times we've been taught, especially in religious settings, that if you have those fantasies, those are a threat to your partnership. Those will come in between you and your partnership. They will destroy your marriage. These are all things I've heard kind of over the pulpit. Whereas understanding this emotional component actually gives a new framing to some of these other things that are wilder or more taboo, that they still have that emotional component of wanting to connect with that primary partnership.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that these themes we've been discussing are not mutually exclusive, meaning you just have one or the other. Oftentimes people's fantasies will combine multiple elements here at once. So, for example, a group sex fantasy, like you mentioned, there could be this strong emotional component to it where, you're the center of attention in that fantasy and you're just feeling very desired and wanted and validated by the other people who are there. So, it's not necessarily just about an act or activity. There's this bigger emotional subtext to it that I think we often ignore or gets lost in our conversations and discussions about this.
Yeah. And when you're in that same example, especially if your spouse is watching that or participating in that, that's now you have like the fantasy of that connection with your partner and all of that other stuff you just mentioned. That's pretty powerful. So,
right.
Yeah.
And sometimes in the group fantasies, what people find most arousing is watching their partner receive pleasure, right? Because maybe that's really what turns you on, is seeing your partner be happy, right? And be pleasured and satisfied. So that can be a big arousing part of a lot of these fantasies as well.
Very good. All right. And then the last one was kind of this idea of sexual flexibility. So this is where you get into maybe themes of different sexual orientations or different gender identity types of themes. You want to talk a little bit, because that's a big umbrella. So you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this section involved people who say identify as heterosexual but have a same-sex fantasy. Conversely, there are also some people who identify as homosexual but have fantasies about the other sex. This also involved the gender-bending fantasies, where people are playing with their gender role or expression. So that could be cross-dressing, or it could be having a transgender partner. So it's just sort of pushing the boundaries of our sexual orientation or identity, or our gender role and identity in some way. These fantasies were a bit less common than the other ones that we've been talking about. But what's interesting is I see that women are more likely to have the sort of sexual flexibility fantasies, where they're playing with their sexual orientation, whereas men are more likely to have the gender-bending fantasies, where they're playing with their gender role and expression in some way.
So two thoughts I'm having as you talk about that. One is, the classic, I think, pushback that most people would say, well, are you really a lesbian if you like watching, heterosexual sex, or if that turns you on? How do you know that you're really a lesbian if that's what's going on in your head? And that could go for, a gay man too, or a straight man. Like, why, if you're having a same-sex fantasy, doesn't that mean that you're just repressing your gayness, or things of that nature? So what would you have to say about that?
So I think the way to think about this is that it's all on a spectrum. We tend to like to think of people as falling into these neat little categories, and most people look at it as either you're heterosexual or you're gay, and that's it, with nothing in between. But there's also bisexuality and various shades of bisexuality. People can be mostly heterosexual or mostly homosexual. People can be asexual. It's this whole spectrum of attractions, identities, behaviors. And I think we need to get away from this idea that we can just lump everybody into a neat little box, and that you're only ever going to have, this one very narrow set of attractions, fantasies and behaviors forever.
Yeah. And then the second thought I had about this too is, I think women, what I have found, and I don't know if this was covered in your book or not, but I think in my experience, a lot of times women have been socialized to really have a lot of sexuality be about male pleasure. And so I know I've heard a lot of women say, I'm really not that, if it was just me and I was going to have sex with a woman, that really doesn't turn me on at all. But the fact that it turns on my husband to watch me with a woman, now all of a sudden that's an arousing thought, right? So kind of this intersection between kind of her heterosexual fantasy with her husband that now brings in a gender or a sexual orientation type of playfulness. And then you also mentioned kind of situational. So like, prison populations versus outside of prison, so when you're limited to the people around you, you might have more flexibility than if you weren't as limited. So I don't know if those things bring up some thoughts for you.
Yeah, I think our sexuality and sort of what you're saying there is very much contextually dependent, on the environment that we're in, our options that are available, who we have as a partner. So, I think there's often a tendency to think that sexuality is very much just sort of this inborn drive, and that, you only have these attractions, and as a result, you're only going to have these behaviors. But our sexuality is also very much situational, and it's affected by our culture. It's affected by the substances that we consume. It's affected by who our partners are. All of these things come together to determine what our sexual behaviors and attractions are going to be.
All right. Any closing thoughts as far as these first 7 broad themes that I'm either not asking you about or that you don't want to kind of wrap it up?
So I think if you're fantasizing about any of these things that we've talked about, you're chances are you're normal in terms of your sexual fantasy profile. And there isn't a reason to feel so much shame and guilt and anxiety about them. It doesn't, again, necessarily mean that you need to act on all of these things. And it's important to recognize the difference between a fantasy and a desire. But I think just having that better understanding of what's normal when it comes to sex, in the sense of what's common, can just be a very helpful starting point for a lot of people.
I think this is incredibly helpful. I mean, the more we can normalize our sexuality, our fantasies, the thoughts that we're having, understand that we're not weird or broken, or that our partner isn't weird or broken, we avoid such unnecessary tragedy, which I see in my office every day. You know, again, I mentioned meaning ruts. People come up with meanings. And if you think this must mean this. And really, those are not very well-researched correlates that most people are coming up with as far as trying to make meaning of those things. So we are kind of unique individuals. We're sexual creatures. We have a lot of, like you said, contextual and variety and diversity within us. And that shows up in our sexuality. And that's true even if you're in love, or even if you're in a monogamous relationship, or even if you're religious, or even if your values or morals don't always make sense of what's coming up in your sexual brain. I often say your sexual brain doesn't know that you're Mormon or Catholic or Jewish. Anyway, I can't thank you enough for your time. I hope to have you back. I don't expect an answer right now because I'd like for you to have time to think about that, but love to have you back to even delve into more. Please check out his book. It's called Tell Me What You Want. Super fascinating. I learned a lot about it and I was validated a lot by it. So I was thrilled to read it, and lots more content that we didn't even get into. So thank you so much for your time and willingness to be with us today.
Thanks, Natasha. It was my pleasure.
All right. Take care. Have a good day yourself. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. till we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go. All wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary love.